vais acabando, por favor. Tenemos poco tiempo. Arratsaldeon.
Hi, we've got very little time. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's commence the press conference of the production, US production, Gravity, and that, as you know, is going to be projected within the Pearls section of the film festival. The press viewing has just been shown, but at 6:15 this afternoon it will be shown to the general public. So let's take advantage of these 25 minutes to present the film. We've got the director and co-scriptwriter Alfonso Cuarón, accompanied by the other scriptwriter, Jonas Cuarón. Let's commence the press conference. I just want to clear up, it's a UK, US, British and US production, by the way, just to clear that point up. I want to congratulate you for the film, for this up in front version of 2001. We all applauded it, we enjoyed it, and to ask you, as regards to your obsession for these different sequences and the shots and how you take it, and why was that obsession and that complex entry of the film at the beginning? Obsession. Well, the truth is, I'm not too sure whether it was an obsession. There's a part which is very important of my development as a director, which has to do with Manu Lubetsky, the DOP, director of photography. And in Tu Mamá También, we started to explore. We had done in the past, in different films, we had done parts of this type of sequences of scenes or shooting. The theory in general is that the character and the context have the same weight. They have the same weight, shall we say. So that we don't favor, because the ops or whether do the editing, as they have the same weight and importance to the audience. The audience has to carry out the equation, and it also has to play with real time, it's as if the camera was only being the witness of something that's happening in real time. With Gravity, something more above all this occurred, was that when we studied documentaries of space scenes and trips, when you see in IMAX or in Discovery Channel, for example, the NASA documentaries, they are all in one, they don't have the luxury of cutting scenes, so therefore it's all done in one long shoot of the scene. So therefore, and Y Tu Mamá También also, because it was a point of view, it was shot in sequencing, but you're observing all of the time. So in fact, there's a narrator, there's a narrative, so that you have a critical judgment of what's going on. But here is all the contrary, that is to say, in these sequences, you get, it's so that you can get submerged into the reality that's taking place on the screen. And that was why we wanted to give the same weight objectively with the character, and when the disaster takes place, for example, we continue the character objectively, and then the camera is anchored with the character and rotating with the character, and finally the camera enters into the mask and the helmet of the character, and then it goes from an objective to a subjective point of view. So the theory is when the camera leaves, it's not even subjective or objective, it's a point of view of the audience who's floating along with the characters in space. It's as if the audience turns into a third astronaut or a second astronaut later on. Okay. I'm not going to congratulate you for the film. What I want to say is, but thank you very much for the film. I've spent several days here and I've congratulated many directors and actors, but I think that I've lied always. But frankly, I'm very surprised with what I've seen today, and I've still got adrenaline and I've still got chills down my backbone, and I think it plays in the league. I've not felt like this, like films like Saving Soldier Ryan, Titanic, and films of this nature. I want to ask a couple of questions and a request. In not to waste time, the questions are, I imagine you've been advised by NASA or perhaps European Space Agency, whether they've talked about any similar cases happening, and then also if you take any references from video games, because I've seen there was a lot of first close-ups. There's a video game with a similar subject matter. It's called Dead Space, but I see a bit of an image which of a video game, and also request Gravity 2 for the 62nd edition here or whatever. Gravity 2, yes, please. Yes, the Revenge of Godzilla. As regards to the video games, I can say that The one that I liked very much was Pac-Man, and then I got stuck in Space Invaders. That's where the influence lies, mate. But you're much younger, Jonas. What video games do you play? I didn't use video games very much either, but from the beginning, as he was saying, there was an idea that it was an experience almost also subjective for the audience, that is to say, that the audience felt like that everything that happens during 19 minutes would felt like a roller coaster ride when the audience was holding on to their seats. On the one hand, we wanted that trip like full of adrenaline, a big adrenaline rush, and without missing it, trying to vary different subject matter and involve the audience in a very on an emotional level. Our idea was, if we simplified the narrative to create this experience, we're going to be able to create something which is more a catharsis and much more direct experience with the audience. It all stems. Jonas is now preparing a script which is called Desert, El Desierto, with Gael Garcia Bernal. And when I read it, I said, I don't have too many notes. I want you to help me to make a script like this. And the theory that we bring along is that cinema can be, and there are examples of films like this, that when you undress the narrative, and especially if you concentrate on your character, there seems to be there starts to be an identification that the character turns into a vehicle so that the audience can invest their own experience, emotional experience into it. So therefore it's the emotional journey of the character, but in turn, at the same time, the audience, in a manner which is totally non-rational and unconsciously, connects themselves through their own experiences in a way which is almost visceral and almost archetypical. So therefore, that is to say, what we were saying is that the film, the truth be said, is the story of an astronaut. Not an astronaut, it's the story of a woman who's lost in space, and she's going in the void, and she's cast away and getting further and further away of human communications. And so therefore, that metaphor, to a certain extent, you don't have to be an astronaut to have it. It can be a man or can be a woman, it can be whatever. It's a character who lives in his or her own bubble. So therefore, it's the metaphorical elements, to a certain extent, non-rationally or non-rationally, they emotionally make you get involved while you're following an action which at the end of the day is a story of adversities, and everybody has adversities throughout their own lives. Hi. Fascinating, your proposal. It's incredible how you've taken us into space. I want to ask you, those dialogues between Sandra Bullock when she says, I can fall on my feet or I'll get burnt in 10 minutes' time. In any case, what I'm going to do is to try to live, I forget the word, an incredible experience. You said it'll be an experience or incredible experience that she's going to. Could you apply that to what the project was like for you? Because cinema needs new paths to follow that involve risk. Could we read it that way? What I can say is that the journey of this film was similar to the journey of the character in the film. It took 4.5 years to reshoot because of a mistaken calculation, no more. Because when we wrote the script, we thought that it was going to be a relatively simple film with some special effects. And it wasn't until we started, like 2 weeks after reading the script, we started to apply, to make tests, and it was quite clear that there didn't exist the technology to be able to do it, and that's when things got complicated. And this is linked to the other question. It was also when we started to be advised by experts of intelligent people, not film directors, and writers and authors. And as of there, everything got even more complicated because we wanted to be quite faithful to the behavior of what happens under microgravity. which is the correct technical term that they use, and with zero resistance. So therefore, this started to complicate things more and more. In the script, you started to talk to other brainstorm of people. Yes, we want to be faithful to reality. We carry out an in-depth research into the field, and we started to change things. In the first script, we had certain things that when people who are more specialists said, no, that would never ever happen. So therefore, we had to modify and change things. And the truth is, the most difficult thing in the script, even more so in the production process, is to understand how things work in zero gravity. Our brain is programmed to see things with gravity. In fact, in the film, a lot of animators got involved. To a certain extent, it's like an animation. And the drawers, they start to draw as of a horizon and gravity. And here, what we were asking was to get rid of a horizon and gravity. And this experience, it's not very intuitive. So therefore, they had to learn to do things again. And the first part was the conceptual part. And in the conceptual part, the technological side of things was another journey on its own. Alfonso and Jonas, first of all, congratulations for Universal Networks in the US and TV America. I wanted to ask both of you, how was the experience of being able to work together? How special is it when that happens in your own family? And how do you perceive the panorama of the cinema in Latin America that you see through your son and you have to confront through your career? The experience of working together was very good, was very positive and very pleasant. I think on the one hand, we understand, I grew up with him, so therefore I understand quite well what he likes. And the punishments I give him sometimes. I don't know. What do you think? Well, the story is the truth. It's a relationship of two writers. I had admired since I started to read some of the first things that he started to write. I already admired the way he wrote, and we had collaborated in something, in a short film with Naomi Klein, and we started to understand each other quite well. But when you're working, it's merely a creative relationship, and as collaborators, the truth is, there doesn't exist family or only family comes into it when you start to talk about things for a shortcut, for example. Because we have a common experience, we've lived together. When we talked about Greenland, he'd been there, I'd been there, and in different times, but we knew what we were referring to. And cinema, I think Latin American cinema is in a moment which is a very impressive moment, and it has been for quite a while now. There's always a fear that a generation emerges which is surprising, or that sets a certain brand, a certain level, and then subsequently everything falls asleep again or becomes latently asleep. But other generations, it's more and more interesting. I dare say, for example, the new cinema, that's being made now with the new generations, is much more interesting than of the cinema in my generation, and including my own. And what's interesting is that it's not one or two countries. We can see that it's a phenomenon which is quite extensive. As I believe less in countries, I think it's not a question of countries, because we're seeing it throughout the world. It's a generational issue. There's a new generation which comes along without the complexes of the previous generations, and that's being reflected in the cinema that they're making. Hi, first of all, thank you. Over here, thank you. I want to give two practical examples of what the film achieves. The first is when Sandra Bullock lifts her feet on the sand physically as well as spiritually, and secondly, when she takes her suit off for the first time, her spacesuit, and all of a sudden she gets into the position of a fetus, and the cables of the suit were like as if it was an umbilical cord. These moments manage to make what is abstract and concrete collide, and they come into a pure organism of pure cinema. When does a director realize visualizing it, writing it, or contemplating it for the first time, watching it for the first time? I think you can talk about this. When do you realize this happens? Well, from the script, all of those images were there. It was quite clear that it was a story of how a character, through confronting adversities can have a certain type of rebirth from the sense that the character obtains new knowledge. And that moment when she enters into the space station is a moment in which she gets rid of the old skin and she enters into the womb. And that was Jonas's idea, to try to get rid of dialogue, and we use the backstory, and to leave it at a minimum level, sufficiently so that the people or the audience isn't asking themselves questions all the time, isn't asking itself a question all the time. And the emotional experience is exactly what you mentioned. At the end, we saw the ending. It's either that lake, which is also quite dirty, like amniotic liquid, or a primordial sort of soup or broth. And there's a soup where there's amphibians swimming, and there's a frog. The character comes out and dragging himself like the first animals, that developed animals that came out of the water, and then she gets onto hands and knees, and then she finally stands up, bent over, until she straightens up. It's like a small nod to the Darwinian evolution, but that's at the same time, it's this character is metaphorically what she has to do is put her feet on earth. When you undergo adversities, you lose your balance, you lose your touch with earth, contact with earth, and even more so because they leave your control or your comfort zone. And that comfort zone, once you leave it, unless you start to put your feet on the ground, you start to lose yourself more and more, and that's the reality that takes place with the character, and that's what she has to find again or recover. Hi, congratulations, Alfonso and Jonas. Fernanda Solorza from Mexico. The Letras Libres magazine congratulate you. Above all, I'm a bit astonished, and your film has left me awestruck. It's been very moving. Everyone has enormous expectation in Mexico, and beyond all of the adjectives of the film, I want to ask you something, with something you said in Mexico in 2006 when you presented the sons of children of men. And that's the directors like you and González Iñárritu, photographers like Itio, and they were luxury immigrants, and despite the fact that one of the strong points is immigration in Mexico in some cinema, you said there was no point of comparison with that type of immigration, but to a certain extent we're talking about economics, and the country is not giving you the opportunity of making what you could make, like Gravity, and you had to do it in other places. What do you think of all that right now in that context? Well, I think that to pretend a film like Gravity to be done outside a context, forget about countries. Outside the context of studios, it would be very strange to find another country that would invest this much money. There are very few, you can count the films in the world that are not produced by the big studios that can come close to these budgets. In the case of Gravity, it is not applicable really too much from that perspective. And at that time, I was talking about an issue which was a question, a personal issue in what happens in my career. Above all, it reflects upon the opportunities and the support given to new directors. And that was just, for example, before 226. I say now, there are certain there are certain incentives that are arriving now, but there's still a long way to go. But what we need the most, and now we're entering into a question of, how we say, Mexican politics, which has to do with the relationship of TV, which is connected to all of this. But Fernando, I think we should do it within a context of Mexican press and not international press, because I think we would get lost there. Thank you very much. Hi, a question for Alfonso. I would like to ask you of a film because of its importance, is linked to this. Perhaps you might deny it, but I know it's going to happen. The fact that Sandra Bullock is the protagonist, it's going to be taken as something frivolous by the audience. How would you convince them that Sandra Bullock is worthwhile, and why did you choose her? I don't have to convince anyone to see the film. Just watch the film. The truth is, it's not up to me, but Sandra, if you look how she portrays her role, not now at the end, but when we were shooting, and if you would have seen when we were shooting the film, in the conditions in which this woman was shooting the film and portraying her role, it's impressive. The discipline, the precision of this woman, and plus her capacity to be abstract, to abstraction. She was, Chivo Lubezki would say she was playing within an iPod. She was portraying a role within an iPod. She was stuck in a box full of LED lights, yes, and surrounded by robots, those that build cars, and the closest human being was 20 meters away, including me, because we couldn't be too close because of all the technology that was required, communicating through the radio. And what she had to do, these very long scenes or long takes, and it was a choreographic memorization she had to keep in mind of different numbers. It was like a ballet dancer rehearsing a very difficult choreography with impressive accuracy, by the way, and in turn, when she rehearsed so much and the physical work that she had to do to achieve it, working with puppeteers, because quite often the puppeteers wanted to, what do they call it, the war horse. There's a play that Spielberg, which is called The War Horse, and it's done with giant puppeteers, and the puppeteers helped her. When we were shooting, all of that disappeared, and everything for her was just portraying and using emotion. I'm talking about all the work previous to that. I say that all of a sudden there was so many technical aspects. And I said, well, we did a take, and I said, cut, and I said, hey, Chivo, we're half a second behind. You're an asshole. Can't you realize the miracle that you've just recorded in this woman and what she's just done? It was quite impressive to see that. So therefore, I don't have to sell Sandra. I think people can see her on the screen in the film, and that's it. We've got time for one final question. Hi. Hi, good afternoon. You can be very happy, the truth be said, because I've heard bravo, and everything that I've heard in the festival, I've not heard anybody say bravo, and no one had applauded so much. Thank God, no, you're not in the official competition, because otherwise you would probably have won it, and there's nobody left behind you. But the question is as follows. Mr. Cuarón, the story, as this way back, does it go back when the story was already in your mind a long time ago? And the second is the training of Sandra Bullock and George Clooney. I imagine it would have been hard with special trainers or true astronauts or not, or genuine astronauts. Well, you can talk about the story. We'd written another script that because of, well, you know, what happens in life all of a sudden. When we were about to do the film, it was stopped, and we were sitting down one night talking about whether we could rewrite that script. I'd shown him this other script that I was preparing, and all of a sudden that same night we started to talk about the idea of making a film of this style, which was like a trip full of adrenaline rush for 90 minutes, but the adrenaline should not leave to one side, that we also addressed different issues, albeit it was the vehicle to talk about all of this. And that same night, it was a long night where you talk and things started to emerge, and we started to talk about, under what situation could we put a character in that was a very adverse situation. Two images emerged, which are like the images that we always guide us, which is one is that of an astronaut spinning around and going all the way like a castaway into the void, and the other one is the image of her getting up for the first time at the end of the film, out of the water, getting out of the water. And that's how we divided, and we talked about references of film. And in fact, we didn't have any reference of any space films. We talked about Reto a Muerte, which was called the first one. Yeah, the devil on wheels. It's different all over the place. So therefore, vanishing, we talked about Vanishing Point. We even talked about Runaway Train. But above all, we talked a lot about the film by Bresson, A Man Condemned to Death Escapes. So therefore, we wanted to follow that idea that the film by Bresson, and I can't compare this film with Bresson, that would be absurd. But the idea of that film, when the character has to escape from a jail, and the walls almost turn into metaphysical walls, and when he leaves and escapes from jail and he jumps over the last wall, he's out on the street and he starts to walk, and that's where the film finishes. It's quite clear that the story is that. It's not the story that he's going to catch him later and what's going to happen later. That's irrelevant, because at the end of the day, it's almost a metaphorical trip or journey of escaping the jail in the Bresson film. But it was in one afternoon or one evening, or just after we started to shoot, and we were advised by what Sandra Bullock, especially due to the technology, the hardest technology was for her. She started to physically train 5 months before starting to shoot. And then she started to carry out choreographic rehearsals for 2 months. And then she maintained conversations. Quite curious, all of a sudden you turn up and you call her up. She said, "Wait, hang on." She said, "Hang on a second. I'm talking to the space station." And she was talking to an astronaut in the space station who was... Sandra was very interested in understanding exactly how your body reacts under zero gravity, and also the state of mind when you see the Earth from that distance. Yeah, well, thank you very much.